For the next question, question B, part 2, the question says, give 2 possible reasons for the change in current account for USA from 1996 to 1998. So notice the directive word of this question is to say give, right? Give doesn't quite equal to the word explain. It seems that when they say give, it's just identify 2 possible reasons without having to explain. Now, however, right, we need to be sensitive to the mark allocation. It cannot possibly be that if I ask you to identify 2 reasons and I give you 4 marks for it, right? So the fact that the directive word of give would imply you only need to identify, the question carrying 4 marks here, right, suggests that each of the 2 reasons that you give need to be explained at least on a relatively brief manner to show how how those reasons led to the observed change in the current account. So take note, 4 marks, you need to explain each reason, even though briefly, you will still need to explain as opposed to simply identify reasons. All right, what are you supposed to explain reasons for? For the change in the current account from USA between 1996 to 1998. So looking at the column for USA, 1996 current account in US dollar was negative $124 billion, right, US dollars, right? And in 1998, it will be negative 215 billion US dollars. So based on this observation, we can see that there was a deficit in 96 and then the deficit became larger. And you're supposed to come up with 2 reasons, right? The fact that they ask for possible reasons means that any reasonable reason would be acceptable as long as it's not an unreasonable reason, right? After that, you need to just provide a brief explanation. Now, how brief is brief? Well, let's look at an example. Suppose you chose for the first point, say, perhaps USA had a high relative inflation rate. When we say USA has a high relative inflation rate, who is it high relative to? It's high relative to the trading partners of USA, or at least the major trading partners of USA. So for instance, right, if US had a higher inflation rate compared to its trading partners, what would happen to import expenditure of USA? Well, first, let's take note that as a result of inflation in those economies that are USA's trading partners, if they experience inflation, prices of goods and services in their economies are going to increase. Well, that means goods and services that American households would buy and import from these countries would have to be more expensive as well. So the prices of imports that Americans have to pay would now have to increase, right? So PM rises. Now, as a consequence, ceteris paribus, American consumers are by right supposed to buy less based on law of demand. However, in this case, ceteris paribus doesn't hold because in our scenario, America is experiencing inflation also, and that America's inflation rate was higher than that of the trading partners, which means that foreign goods have become more expensive, American goods have become more expensive at a faster rate, making foreign goods still more attractive to the American consumers in spite of their higher prices. As a consequence, American consumers end up buying more imported goods rather as well. So the quantity of imports increase in spite of the price increase. Now, the import expenditure by Americans will be the price times quantity would surely overall have to increase as well. Now, note here that since P and Q are both rising, there was no need to make any assumption pertaining to the price elasticity of demand for imports in America. Right, so then we know M rises for America. Now, how about X then for America? Since America was facing inflation as well, so prices of American goods become more expensive. Whatever the American economy was exporting to the trading partners is also becoming more expensive for the foreigners, right? Remember, we are assuming ceteris paribus, so exchange rate between the 2 countries should not have changed under ceteris paribus assumption. So with export prices increase, other countries, although are also facing inflation, but inflation in these other countries are occurring at a lower rate, which means American goods are becoming less attractive due to the fact that it's getting more expensive and getting more expensive faster than the goods in their own countries. So quantity of exports sold from America to these other countries should fall, so QX should fall. Now, if PX is rising and QX is falling, the product of the 2, which is export revenue, will it be rising or falling? The answer is actually indeterminate at this point. Now, so what we do is we add a simplifying assumption here that the that the price elasticities of demand for exports in America on average is greater than 1. So as a consequence, the fall in quantities, right, for each export that America sells on average is more than proportionate than their corresponding increase in prices, resulting in an overall decrease in export revenue. Now, this assumption may or may not be true, but do we justify why we make this assumption? We could, right? We could justify this assumption, but again, take note of the mark allocation. We have 4 marks. Each reason is going to carry 2 marks. So if one of the reasons is inflation rate is high in America relative to trading partners, I have 1 extra mark for elaboration of my reasoning. This justification of the assumption isn't a priority anymore, right? We could justify, but it's not going to cost us marks if we did not justify the assumption. All right, so then with this assumption, we can conclude that X should have fallen for America. So together with X falling and M rising, balance of trade, which is X minus M, would decrease, right? Now, based on the data we saw earlier, the CA was in deficit 1996, right, of $124 billion deficit. So what would happen when the balance of trade worsened? The balance of trade would have worsened to turn the deficit into a larger deficit. This would be one possible reason and the explanation that we will provide. Now, so that's point number 1. Now, suppose you want to give a point number 2. Let's say the second, because they asked for 2 reasons, right? So the second reason you might want to talk about is, say, US dollar had appreciated against other currencies, especially the currencies of its major trading partners. Then an elaboration of how that would actually cause the US balance of trade and hence the current account to worsen from a deficit to a larger deficit. Then you simply explain the process. In this case, recommend that you consider using the Marshall-Lerner condition here when explaining this process. All right, so that's for question 2, B part 2.